Today I'm going to go to the Pacific Northwest of the United States, Portland, Oregon. Right here, where a guy who identified himself as Dan Cooper on November 24th, 1971, went to the flight counter of Northwest Orient Airlines and paid cash for a one-way ticket to Seattle. So they took off from here at this airport, Portland Airport. They took off on time, which was 2:50 p.m. It was a 30-minute flight to Seattle, right up here. And shortly after takeoff, he handed a note to a flight attendant that was sitting next to him at the back of the airplane. The flight attendant put the note in her purse because she thought it was just another lonely businessman giving her his number. When Dan Cooper watched her put it in her purse, he leaned toward her and whispered, "Miss, you better look at that note. I have a bomb." She read the note. He took the note back from her. She asked if she could see the bomb. He showed it to her, and then he gave her his demands. He demanded $200,000 in what he called negotiable American currency, 4 parachutes, and a fuel truck standing by at Seattle so he could refuel the plane upon arrival. The flight attendant went forward and told the pilot. And for 2 hours, the airplane circled right up here in the Puget Sound as the president of the airline authorized payment of the ransom, and the police and FBI assembled the cash and the parachutes. There were 36 other passengers on board, and they were told a lie. They were told that their landing would be delayed due to a minor mechanical difficulty. At 5:24, almost 2 hours after they arrived, Cooper was informed his demands had been met, and at 5:39 the plane landed here in Seattle, right here. Now, after he had the money and the parachutes and he was fueled, he released the 36 other passengers and then took off at 7:40 p.m. with just the pilot, the co-pilot, the engineer, and 2 flight attendants. There were only 5 people on that flight. Their final destination was Reno, Nevada, so they took off from here and they were heading towards Reno, Nevada. And once they were in the air, he informed the flight attendants to go to the front of the plane with the rest of the crew into the cockpit and close the door behind them. One of the flight attendants said as she was going up in that direction, she looked back and could see this guy who identified himself as Dan Cooper tying something to his waist. Now, originally his name was Dan Cooper, but the media at some point got it wrong and started calling him D.B. Cooper. So that's where the famous name D.B. Cooper came from. While the 5 employees of the airline were in the cockpit, it was 8 p.m. when a warning light flashed in the cockpit indicating that the tail door stairs had been opened. It was a 727. It was flight 305, and it was a 727. And here's a picture of a 727 with its tail door open. This is what it looked like. This was the type of plane that Dan Cooper or D.B. Cooper hijacked right here. So when the warning light went off, it was indicating that this back door right here was actually opened. Now, like I said, that warning light came on at 8 p.m. and some of the instructions that Dan Cooper gave the pilot was not to fly the plane faster than 120 miles an hour, keep the flaps down to 15 degrees. So it was clear that this man knew something about aeronautics. He knew the plane could fly at 120 miles an hour, and he knew 15 degrees on the flaps would keep it there. So he had knowledge. 13 minutes after the warning light flashed, the tail section of the 727 suddenly experienced an upward movement. And they're pretty certain that's when Dan Cooper jumped, because a while later the FBI went up with one of those airplanes and they threw a 200-pound something out of the airplane, and the plane did the exact same thing it did at 8:13 when it had the experience of the tail suddenly moving upward. Now, they knew how fast the plane was flying, and they estimated that around 8 o'clock when the back door opened, they were, roughly in this area, and when the tail section had the upward movement experience, they were roughly right about in here, so they were pretty certain that Dan Cooper or D.B. Cooper jumped somewhere in this area right here. Now, there's been a lot of theories about what happened or what really happened, and I'm not going to get into those theories. I'm just going to talk about a couple of things that we do know. And here's one of them. In 1978, a placard was found by a deer hunter with printed instructions for lowering the aft stairs or the back stairs of a 727, and it was about 13 miles east of Castle Rock. So here's Castle Rock, and 13 miles east is roughly in this general area right here. And the location that they found this placard with those instructions on it is well within the flight of 305's flight path right here. Now keep in mind, they estimate that he jumped somewhere in here and that the plane continued on heading towards Reno, Nevada, and it very well could have fallen off high enough for it to easily land in this area right here. So that's one thing we know. The second thing we know for certain is this. It was in February of 1980 when an 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram was scooping up sand for a fire pit along the Columbia River on a beach called Tina Bar. And that would be right here. This right here is called Tina Bar, and little Brian Ingram was with his family, and they were going to dig a hole in the sand to have a fire pit. But he ended up uncovering 3 bundles of $20 bills that was $5,800 worth, and each one of them had the serial numbers of the cash that was given to Dan Cooper. What was interesting about this find is it was buried in the sand roughly right about in this general area. Right in here is where the kid found it. And the rubber bands that were wrapped around the $20 bills were still there, still intact, and they had not deteriorated. So that's one thing that we know is a fact. It's also interesting to know that the Columbia River runs west. In this section it runs north, so it runs from the east to the west, which means Dan Cooper could not have dropped the money up here in the water and had it float down here because the river runs in the other direction. There was also some people saying that the money was dredged there or picked up by a dredge and dropped off there, but after some people went in and checked it out, they said that a dredge putting it there would be too impossible because the distances from the water and such wouldn't have worked. But there were also some people saying that D.B. Cooper jumped much further south, like maybe over here or over here, and the Columbia River brought it to this area. However, they're pretty certain that he jumped somewhere up in this area here, and the flight path of the plane was in line with that because of the placard that they found 13 miles east of Castle Rock. So I'm not going to get into the theories like I said, but what I am going to talk about is my opinion, and I like to think about what we do know. So here's what we know. We know that a placard was found 13 miles east of Castle Rock. That was from the airplane that he jumped out of. Pretty certain. We know that $5,800 of cash was found right here on Tina Bar along the Columbia River. We also know that a body was never found, a parachute was never found, a briefcase with a bomb or fake bomb in it was never found, clothing was never found, and nothing was ever found. I also think that this Dan Cooper was smart enough to plant money right down here to confuse people. Maybe he put it there and hoped that one day they'd find it and they'd realize that he got away. But as far as a river taking it there or a dredge, I'm not agreeing with that. I think the guy got away with it. I think he got away with it. He probably didn't spend the money. Maybe he was a thrill seeker and this was just a big game to him. He wanted to see if he could get away with it, and he did. So there you have it. The rough locations and flight path of the infamous D.B. Cooper from Google Earth.